The early morning light streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Peter's Basilica, casting colorful patterns across the marble floor. Inside, workers hustled about, arranging chairs and setting up equipment for the evening's charity concert. Vatican City was buzzing with excitement, and at the center of it all was Pope Leo XIV, who had been elected just 3 months ago. In his private quarters, Pope Leo XIV adjusted his white skull cap and glanced at himself in the mirror. At 68, he had kind eyes and a gentle smile that had endeared him to Catholics worldwide. Born Antonio Ricci in a small town near Florence, he had devoted his life to the church, steadily rising through its ranks with humility and wisdom. Tonight would be his first major cultural event as Pope, and he felt both excited and nervous. "Your Holiness," called his secretary, Father Donato, knocking softly on the door. "Cardinal Bianchi is here to discuss the final arrangements for tonight's concert." The Pope welcomed the cardinal, a tall man with silver hair who oversaw cultural affairs at the Vatican. "Everything is in place," Cardinal Bianchi reported. "The Swiss Guard has reviewed security measures and all 700 tickets have been sold. The proceeds will go to the Children's Hospital in Rome as you requested." "Excellent," said Pope Leo, nodding. "And our guest performer, this pianist everyone is talking about." "Alessandro Moretti," Cardinal Bianchi supplied. "Quite controversial, but undeniably talented. He's currently the most celebrated pianist in Europe." The Pope's eyes lit up at the name. "Ah, yes. I've heard recordings of his Bach interpretations. Quite modern, aren't they?" Cardinal Bianchi cleared his throat. "Indeed. Some traditionalists find his approach too experimental, but younger audiences adore him. He's bringing classical music to a new generation." "That's what matters," Pope Leo said, though a slight furrow appeared on his brow. "Music should evolve while honoring its roots. Just like faith." The cardinal hesitated before adding, "I should mention, Your Holiness, that Moretti has a reputation for being rather outspoken. He's criticized the Church in the past for being too conservative in its artistic patronage." Pope Leo XIV waved his hand dismissively. "The Church has always had a complex relationship with artists. They challenge us, as they should. I look forward to meeting him." Across town in the luxurious Hotel de Russie, Alessandro Moretti was practicing on a grand piano that had been brought to his suite. At 35, he was at the height of his powers, handsome, charismatic, and fiercely independent. His fingers danced across the keys with remarkable speed and precision as he worked through a particularly difficult passage of Bach's The Art of Fugue. His manager, Paolo, sat nearby scrolling through his phone. "The Vatican concert is trending online," he reported. "Tickets sold out in hours. You've managed to make Bach cool again." Alessandro barely acknowledged him, lost in the music. He abruptly stopped, dissatisfied with a phrase. "Bach would be horrified by how his music is usually performed today," he muttered. "All these stuffy interpretations, treating it like a museum piece." His music was revolutionary for its time. Paolo looked up from his phone. "Just remember where you're playing tonight. The Vatican isn't exactly known for embracing musical revolution." Alessandro laughed. "The new pope is supposedly more progressive than the last one. Maybe he'll appreciate what I'm doing with Bach." "Just be diplomatic," Paolo warned. "This concert is important for your image, especially after that controversy with the Berlin Philharmonic." Alessandro waved him off. "They deserved what I said." Their conductor turned Bach into a funeral march. He closed the piano lid and stood up. "I need some air before the performance. I'm going for a walk." As the afternoon waned, the Vatican began filling with guests. Politicians, diplomats, wealthy donors, and religious leaders from around the world arrived in formal attire, excited not just for the music, but for the chance to see the new pope up close. The Vatican choir, 30 men and women in formal black attire, were rehearsing in a side chapel, their voices blending in perfect harmony. Among them was Sophia, a soprano who had been with the choir for 5 years. Her father had been a church organist, and she had grown up surrounded by sacred music. She paused during a break to peek into the main hall, where technicians were adjusting the lighting around a magnificent Steinway grand piano that gleamed under the basilica's dome. "Excited to hear Moretti?" asked Giovanni, a tenor standing beside her. Sophia nodded. "I've never heard anyone play Bach like he does. Though Father Lorenzo thinks his interpretations are sacrilegious," she added with a small smile, referring to the choir's elderly director. Father Lorenzo thinks anything composed after 1850 is sacrilegious, Giovanni joked. But the new pope seems more open-minded. I heard he has quite a collection of jazz records. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Alessandro Moretti himself, who strode into the basilica flanked by his manager and several Vatican officials. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Sophia and several other choir members watched in awe as he approached the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys to test its action. "Not bad," he declared, loud enough for nearby people to hear. "I've played worse instruments in royal palaces." An hour before the concert, Pope Leo XIV received a small group of major donors in a private reception. He chatted warmly with each person, thanking them for their generosity toward the children's hospital. Though new to the papacy, he had a natural way with people, listening intently and remembering personal details that made each guest feel valued. "Your Holiness," said Cardinal Bianchi, approaching with a nervous smile. "Signor Moretti has arrived and asks if he might meet you briefly before the performance." The Pope's face brightened. "Of course. Please bring him in." A moment later, Alessandro Moretti entered the room. He was shorter than the Pope had expected, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit. Despite the formal setting, he had a casual air about him, with his dark hair slightly tousled and his tie loosened. "Your Holiness," Alessandro said, bowing slightly, "thank you for inviting me to perform in this incredible space." "The honor is ours," Pope Leo replied warmly. "I've listened to your recordings with great interest. Your approach to Bach is refreshing." Alessandro's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've heard my recordings?" "Of course," the Pope smiled. "Before I entered seminary, I studied piano quite seriously. Bach remains close to my heart." This seemed to catch the pianist off guard. "I didn't realize you had a musical background." "There's much the public doesn't know about me," Pope Leo said with a twinkle in his eye. "Perhaps we can discuss music further after the concert. I'm particularly curious about your fingering technique in the contrapuntal passages." Alessandro nodded, visibly reassessing the man before him. "I look forward to it, Your Holiness." As evening fell, St. Peter's Basilica was transformed. Hundreds of candles illuminated the space, complementing the subtle electric lighting. The audience filled the rows of chairs, an impressive gathering of influential people from around the world. Photographers and journalists lined the back wall, their presence indicating the event's significance. The Vatican choir took their positions, and Father Lorenzo stepped onto the small conductor's platform. At precisely 8 o'clock, a hush fell over the crowd as Pope Leo XIV entered through a side door, accompanied by 2 Swiss guards in their colorful Renaissance uniforms. Everyone stood as he made his way to a special chair in the front row, raising his hand in blessing before sitting down. Cardinal Bianchi approached a microphone. "Your Holiness, distinguished guests, we gather tonight in this sacred space to experience the divine gift of music while supporting the children of Rome. It is my honor to present one of the world's greatest pianists, Alessandro Moretti." Applause filled the basilica as Alessandro walked confidently to the piano. He bowed to the audience, then specifically to the Pope before sitting down. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his focus, then placed his hands on the keys. The first notes of Bach's Prelude in C major filled the vast space, but not as most people had heard it before. Alessandro's interpretation was bold and dynamic, with tempos and emphases that highlighted the music's mathematical patterns while infusing it with emotional depth. Some audience members exchanged surprised glances, while others leaned forward in their seats captivated. Pope Leo XIV watched intently, his fingers occasionally moving slightly as if playing along. When the piece concluded, he was among the first to applaud, nodding appreciatively. For the next hour, Alessandro led the audience through a journey of Bach's most challenging works, culminating in selections from The Art of Fugue. The Vatican choir joined him for several pieces, their voices weaving around the piano notes in complex harmonies that showcased both their talent and his. Throughout the performance, Sophia couldn't help noticing how the Pope seemed completely absorbed in the music, unlike some previous papal audiences she had sung for. There was something different about Pope Leo XIV, a genuine passion for culture that went beyond mere papal duty. As Alessandro played the final notes of the evening, The audience erupted in thunderous applause. He stood and bowed deeply, sweat glistening on his forehead from the intensity of his performance. Pope Leo XIV rose to his feet, leading a standing ovation that continued for several minutes. What no one in the audience could anticipate was how this triumphant evening would take an unexpected turn during the reception that followed, how a simple conversation between the pianist and the pontiff would lead to public ridicule, media frenzy, and eventually a revelation that would leave the entire choir and the world utterly shocked. But for now, as the applause echoed through the ancient basilica, it seemed like a perfect night of harmony between art and faith, with no hint of the discord to come. The applause finally subsided as Alessandro Moretti took his final bow. The grand concert hall of St. Peter's Basilica gradually transformed from a temple of music back to its usual solemn self, though excitement still hummed in the air. Vatican staff moved efficiently, setting up for the reception that would follow in the adjacent papal gallery, a stunning room lined with Renaissance artwork and soft lighting from crystal chandeliers. Pope Leo XIV was escorted to the gallery first, where he took his position near a marble fireplace. Though the performance had lasted nearly 2 hours, the Pope appeared energized rather than tired. His eyes sparkled as he discussed the concert with Cardinal Bianchi. "Remarkable technical precision," the Pope said. "Moretti has hands that seem almost supernatural in their abilities." Cardinal Bianchi nodded. "He is indeed gifted, Your Holiness, though some critics say his interpretations stray too far from tradition." The Pope smiled thoughtfully. "Art must breathe to stay alive, Cardinal. But yes, there were moments where I wondered if Bach himself would recognize his own creation." Guests began filtering into the reception area, many of them important donors and dignitaries eager for a few minutes with the new Pope. A string quartet played softly in the corner, as waiters circulated with champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere was one of refined celebration. Sophia and several other choir members entered more discreetly through a side door. They weren't officially part of the reception, but Father Lorenzo had suggested they make an appearance to represent the Vatican choir. "I still can't believe we performed with Alessandro Moretti," Sophia whispered to Giovanni. "My heart was racing the entire time." Giovanni smiled. "He's incredible, even if he does look at the choir like we're just background music for his greatness." Sophia was about to respond when she noticed Alessandro himself entering the gallery. A slight hush fell over the room as people turned to look at him. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, shaking hands and accepting congratulations as he made his way through the crowd. Paolo, his manager, hovered nearby, occasionally whispering names of important guests in Alessandro's ear. They worked their way methodically through the room, the pianist charming everyone with his wit and passion when discussing music. Pope Leo XIV watched from across the room, noticing how Moretti commanded attention. There was something about the pianist that reminded the Pope of himself in his younger years, that same fire, that dedication to art. He found himself wanting to speak with the man more directly, beyond the brief encounter they'd had before the concert. After about 20 minutes, Cardinal Bianchi guided Alessandro toward the Pope. A small circle formed around them as people strained to hear the interaction between these two notable figures. "Your Holiness," Alessandro said, bowing slightly, "I trust the performance met your expectations?" The Pope's smile was warm and genuine. "It exceeded them in many ways, Signor Moretti. Your technical mastery is beyond question." Alessandro nodded, accepting the compliment as his due. "Bach demands nothing less. His music is a mathematical puzzle as much as an emotional journey." "Indeed," said the Pope, "though I found your tempo in the third fugue particularly interesting. Quite a bit faster than how it's traditionally performed." Something flickered in Alessandro's eyes. Pride, perhaps, or defensiveness. "I don't believe in tradition for tradition's sake, Your Holiness. Bach wasn't writing museum pieces. His music was vibrant, alive, even revolutionary for his time." The Pope nodded thoughtfully. "A fair point. Though I wonder if perhaps in the Contrapunctus 9, a slightly more traditional approach might better highlight the interweaving voices." There were moments when the counterpoint seemed to blur. The room grew quieter. Those nearby could sense a shift in the atmosphere. Alessandro's posture stiffened slightly and his smile tightened. "Traditional approach?" he repeated, his voice carrying more than necessary in the hushed room. With all due respect, Your Holiness, that's exactly the kind of thinking that has kept classical music locked in the past century. Cardinal Bianchi coughed nervously. Signor Moretti, perhaps, but Alessandro continued, his voice growing louder. The problem with traditional approaches is that they're often just accumulated, bad habits passed down by mediocre performers who lack the courage to find their own voice. Pope Leo XIV's expression remained calm, though his eyes registered surprise at the pianist's sudden intensity. I merely suggested, do you know how many times I've heard that suggestion? Alessandro interrupted, causing several guests to gasp at his breach of protocol, usually from music critics who couldn't play a simple scale themselves. I didn't expect to hear it in the Vatican. The room had fallen completely silent now. Paolo tried to catch Alessandro's eye, making a subtle cutting motion with his hand, but the pianist was too caught up in the moment. Perhaps the church should stick to Gregorian chants and leave real music to the professionals, Alessandro said with a dismissive wave of his hand. No offense intended, Your Holiness, but Bach requires more than pious reverence. He requires understanding. Sophia covered her mouth in shock. Several photographers who had been allowed into the reception were frantically taking pictures. The Pope's security detail shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to handle this verbal assault that didn't constitute a physical threat. Pope Leo XIV remained remarkably composed. He looked at Alessandro not with anger but with something closer to disappointment. Understanding comes in many forms, Signor Moretti, he said quietly, as does respect. The pianist seemed to realize suddenly that he had gone too far. The flush of righteousness drained from his face as he looked around at the stunned expression surrounding him. But pride kept him from backing down completely. I apologize if my passion for music sometimes overwhelms my diplomacy, he said, though his tone suggested limited remorse. Art demands honesty above all else. Cardinal Bianchi quickly stepped in. I believe the string quartet is preparing a special piece for us. Shall we move toward the east side of the gallery? The awkward moment broke as people began to move away, though the buzz of whispered conversations immediately erupted. Alessandro was quickly pulled aside by his manager, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. Have you lost your mind? Paolo hissed. You just insulted the Pope. The Pope! Alessandro ran a hand through his hair. He was criticizing my interpretation. What was I supposed to do, just smile and nod? Yes, that's exactly what you were supposed to do. Paolo looked around frantically. There are journalists here. This will be everywhere by morning. Across the room, Pope Leo XIV was being escorted to a quieter area by Cardinal Bianchi and his secretary, Father Donato. Though the Pope maintained his dignity, those close to him could see that the public humiliation had affected him. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted a glass of water. I should never have mentioned his interpretation, the Pope said softly. Music is so personal to performers. Your Holiness, you did nothing wrong, Cardinal Bianchi insisted. Moretti's reaction was completely inappropriate and disrespectful. We should issue a statement condemning his behavior. Pope Leo shook his head. No statements, no condemnations. Christ taught us to turn the other cheek, did he not? Father Donato looked concerned. But Your Holiness, his comments about the Church were born of passion, not malice, the Pope finished, though his delivery could certainly use refinement. Meanwhile, Sophia and the other choir members watched the drama unfold from the edges of the room. Giovanni looked stunned. I can't believe he spoke to the Holy Father like that. Over a simple suggestion about Bach? Sophia nodded, equally shocked. Father Lorenzo looks like he might excommunicate Moretti on the spot. She nodded toward their choir director, whose face had turned purple with suppressed rage. As the reception continued with a strained attempt at normalcy, Alessandro and Paolo made a quick exit. Photographers followed them to the door, capturing images of the pianist's tight expression that would appear in newspapers and online media within hours. In the car ride back to his hotel, Alessandro stared out the window as Paolo made frantic phone calls trying to control the damage. The beauty of Rome by night was lost on the pianist as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. They're already calling, Paolo said, covering the phone. The Times, BBC, Rai. Everyone wants a statement. Alessandro closed his eyes. Tell them I stand by what I said about Bach. His music deserves passionate defense. And the part about the Pope being hopelessly outdated and the Church sticking to Gregorian chants? Alessandro winced. I didn't say hopelessly. You implied it clearly enough. Paolo returned to his call, trying to negotiate favorable coverage. Back at the Vatican, the reception was winding down. Pope Leo XIV thanked each guest personally as they departed, showing no outward sign of distress. But when he finally retired to his private quarters, the weight of the evening settled on his shoulders. He sat heavily in a chair by the window, looking out at the moonlit St. Peter's Square. Father Donato entered quietly with a cup of tea. "The press will be unkind tomorrow, Your Holiness. We should prepare a response." Pope Leo XIV looked up with tired eyes. "Prepare nothing yet. Let me pray on this matter." He paused, then added, "And please bring me the complete recordings of Bach's works performed by Moretti. I want to listen to them again." Father Donato looked confused but nodded. "Of course, Your Holiness." As the night deepened, two men in different parts of Rome sat awake. One a humble servant of God newly elevated to the highest position in the church. The other a celebrated artist at the peak of his career. Neither could have predicted how their lives would become entangled in the days to come, nor how a moment of public humiliation would lead to an extraordinary revelation that would leave the world in awe. By dawn, the news had spread like wildfire. Every major newspaper in Rome featured the confrontation on their front pages, with headlines ranging from the factual Pianist criticizes Pope during Vatican concert, to the more sensational Moretti tells Pope to stick to chants, leave Bach to professionals. Photographers had captured the exact moment when shock registered on the faces of those surrounding the Pope, while Alessandro's expression showed a mixture of defiance and passion that made for a perfect visual story. In his hotel room, Alessandro woke to his phone ringing nonstop. Paolo had been up all night, alternating between damage control and yelling at his client. He thrust an iPad into Alessandro's hands as soon as the pianist opened his eyes. "Look at this mess," Paolo said, his voice hoarse from hours of phone calls. "You're trending worldwide and not in a good way." Alessandro scrolled through news articles and social media posts. The story had already evolved beyond what actually happened, with some reports claiming he had deliberately humiliated the Pope as part of an anti-religious statement. Others suggested he had been drunk or on drugs. "This is ridiculous," Alessandro muttered, putting the tablet down. "I didn't say half of these things." "You said enough," Paolo countered. "The Vatican's press office has been flooded with calls. Catholic organizations worldwide are demanding apologies. 3 concert halls have already contacted us about scheduling conflicts for your upcoming tour." Alessandro ran his hands through his hair. It was just a heated moment about musical interpretation. Why is everyone so sensitive? Paolo stared at him in disbelief. Because he's the Pope, not some random critic you can dismiss. He's the spiritual leader of over 1 billion people. He picked up his phone, which was buzzing again. "That's the Milan Symphony. I bet they're canceling too." Across the city at the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV was meeting with his closest advisors in a small conference room. Cardinal Bianchi was advocating for an official response condemning Moretti's behavior, while others suggested ignoring the incident entirely to avoid giving it more attention. "Your Holiness, we must defend your dignity," insisted Cardinal Bianchi. "This man publicly disrespected not just you but the entire church." Pope Leo looked tired. He had slept poorly, spending much of the night listening to Alessandro Moretti's recordings and reflecting on their brief but intense interaction. "What would a condemnation achieve?" he asked quietly. "More headlines? More division? The world has enough of both." Father Donato, who had served the Pope for many years, knew that look on his face. "You have something else in mind, don't you, Your Holiness?" The Pope nodded slowly. "I'm still praying for guidance. For now, our official position is that we have no comment on what was a private conversation about artistic interpretation." The advisors exchanged glances. This was not the forceful response many had hoped for, but they knew better than to push once the Pope had made up his mind. After the meeting, Pope Leo XIV maintained his regular schedule, though those close to him could see that the public confrontation had affected him. During his morning prayers, he spent longer than usual on his knees, his lips moving silently as he sought comfort and direction. When he emerged, there was a new resolve in his eyes that his secretary noticed immediately. "Father Donato," the Pope said, "please contact Sister Lucia at the Vatican Library. Ask her to send me any materials we have on the Milan Conservatory from 1965 to 1975. Father Donato looked puzzled but nodded. "Of course, Your Holiness." Meanwhile, the Vatican choir had gathered for their regular rehearsal, but no one was focused on the music. Instead, they huddled in small groups, discussing the previous night's events with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Father Lorenzo paced back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back. "In all my 40 years serving the church, I have never witnessed such disrespect," he fumed. "And over Bach. As if that young hothead knows more about Bach than anyone else." Sophia sat quietly, remembering how fragile the Pope had looked after the confrontation, despite his calm exterior. She had admired Alessandro Moretti for years, saved up to buy his recordings, even defended his modern interpretations to more traditional choir members. Now she felt betrayed by his behavior. Giovanni approached and sat beside her. He looked deep in thought. "I'm just disappointed," she said. "I thought Moretti would be different somehow. When you admire someone from afar, you create this perfect image of them." Father Lorenzo clapped his hands to get everyone's attention.
"Enough gossip."
"The Holy Father needs our prayers, not our idle talk. Let us channel our feelings into our music." Page 23, Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus. As they began to sing, Sophia noticed a Vatican guard entering the rehearsal room and whispering something to Father Lorenzo. The choir director's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he nodded and continued conducting. Only when they finished the piece did he address the choir again. "I've just been informed that His Holiness has requested we continue with our regular rehearsal schedule this week." "With no changes?" Father Lorenzo looked confused. "He specifically asked that we prepare Bach's Magnificat for next Sunday's Mass." This announcement caused a fresh wave of whispers. Bach's Magnificat was rarely performed during regular services due to its complexity, and the timing seemed significant given the recent confrontation over Bach's music. Outside the Vatican, public opinion had divided sharply. While many Catholics expressed outrage at Alessandro's disrespect, others, particularly in the arts community, defended his passion for music and his right to artistic opinion. Social media was ablaze with debates, memes, and hot takes from people who had never previously cared about either classical music or the Catholic Church. Alessandro ventured out of his hotel in the afternoon, ignoring Paolo's advice to lay low. He needed coffee and fresh air to clear his head. As he walked into a small cafe near the Spanish Steps, he was immediately recognized. An elderly woman glared at him and made the sign of the cross before gathering her things and leaving. The barista, however, gave him a thumbs up and refused to accept payment for his espresso. "You said what many of us think," the young man whispered. "The church needs to modernize." Alessandro felt uncomfortable with both reactions. He hadn't meant to make any statement about the church itself. It was purely about musical interpretation. Yet now he found himself cast as either villain or hero in a cultural war he had never intended to join. Back at his hotel room, he found Paolo waiting with a grave expression. "The Vatican Philharmonic has officially canceled your joint concert next month," Paolo said, "and your Instagram has lost 50,000 followers since this morning." Alessandro slumped into a chair. "What do they want from me? A public apology?" "For starters, yes. I've drafted something appropriate." Paolo handed him a sheet of paper. "It acknowledges that you spoke disrespectfully, expresses regret, and says you were caught up in the passion of artistic discussion." Alessandro read it with a frown. "This makes me sound like I don't stand behind my musical interpretations. At this point, it's not about your musical interpretations." Paolo exploded. "It's about you telling the Pope to stick to Gregorian chants. Do you understand what this is doing to your career? The Catholic Church has influence everywhere, especially in Italy. You're being dropped from festivals, radio stations are pulling your recordings." All right, Alessandro interrupted, holding up his hands in surrender. "I'll sign your apology." Paolo's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He checked it, then looked up with surprise. "That's strange. The Pope's office just announced he'll be giving a special address during Sunday's Mass. The rumor is it will address the incident." Alessandro felt a twist of anxiety. "What do you think he'll say?" "Nothing good for you, I imagine," Paolo replied grimly. As the week progressed, the Vatican maintained its official silence about the confrontation, despite growing media pressure. Pope Leo XIV continued his normal duties, meeting with visiting dignitaries, blessing the faithful at his regular audience, and working on his upcoming homily. Only his closest staff noticed his unusual request to the Vatican Library, and the extra hours he spent alone in the evenings. Sophia and the choir worked intensely on Bach's Magnificat, wondering why the Pope had requested this particular piece at this particular time. The music was challenging, with intricate vocal parts that demanded perfect precision and emotional depth. Father Lorenzo drove them harder than usual, determined that their performance would be flawless. Whatever statement His Holiness wishes to make through this music, we will help him make it, he told them during their final rehearsal on Saturday. By Sunday morning, St. Peter's Basilica was packed beyond capacity. News of the Pope's special address had attracted not just the regular faithful, but curious tourists and journalists hoping for drama. Security was heightened and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. No one knew exactly what Pope Leo XIV planned to say or do in response to his public humiliation. Would he condemn Alessandro Moretti? Forgive him publicly? Use the moment to make a broader statement about respect and discourse in modern society? As the choir took their places, Sophia glanced toward the entrance where the Pope would soon appear. She noticed something unusual near the altar. A piano had been brought in and positioned prominently. This was not normal for a Sunday Mass, and it sent a fresh wave of whispers through the congregation. What was Pope Leo XIII planning? And how would it change the narrative that had captivated the world's attention for the past week? Sunday morning arrived with a buzz of anticipation throughout Vatican City. The sky was a perfect Italian blue, and crowds had begun gathering in St. Peter's Square hours before the service was scheduled to begin. News vans lined the surrounding streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters from around the world checked their microphones and rehearsed their opening lines, all speculating about what Pope Leo XIV might say about the now infamous confrontation with Alessandro Moretti. Inside the Basilica, the Vatican choir was preparing for what promised to be one of their most scrutinized performances. Father Lorenzo paced nervously between the choir members, making last-minute adjustments to their positioning. Remember, the Holy Father specifically requested Bach's Magnificat. This is not just music today, this is a statement. He lowered his voice. Whatever that statement may be. Sophia adjusted her choir robe, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She glanced again at the piano positioned near the altar. Nobody had offered an explanation for its presence, but rumors had spread rapidly among the choir members. Do you think he invited Moretti back to apologize publicly? Giovanni whispered to her. Sophia shook her head. I can't imagine Moretti agreeing to that, not after everything that's happened this week. Their speculation was interrupted by Father Donato, who entered from a side door and approached Father Lorenzo. The two men spoke quietly, with Father Lorenzo's expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Is everything all right? Sophia asked when Father Lorenzo returned to the choir. The director seemed flustered. There's been a change of plans. After the opening procession, the choir is to move to the rehearsal room. Immediately. The rehearsal room? Giovanni repeated. But what about the Mass? The Bach piece? Those are my instructions, Father Lorenzo said, clearly as baffled as they were. We are to go directly to the rehearsal room and wait there. Before anyone could ask more questions, the bells began to toll, signaling the start of the service. The grand doors opened and the procession began. Cardinals in their red robes, bishops, and finally Pope Leo XIV himself entered the basilica to the traditional sounds of the organ. The Pope looked solemn but composed, acknowledging the congregation with gentle nods as he passed. Once the procession reached the altar and the opening prayers had been said, Father Lorenzo gave a subtle signal to the choir. Confused but obedient, they filed quietly through a side door that led to their rehearsal space. The room was large enough to accommodate the 30-person choir, with high ceilings for acoustics and rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle. Sheet music for Bach's Magnificat was still arranged on their stands from yesterday's practice. The choir members took their seats, exchanging puzzled glances. What do you think is happening? Sophia whispered to Giovanni. He shrugged. Maybe there's a security concern? Or the Pope changed his mind about addressing the Moretti situation. Father Lorenzo stood at the front, checking his watch repeatedly. 10 minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. Then 20. Some choir members began to fidget, while others whispered theories about what was going on. Suddenly, the door opened. Everyone expected Father Donato or perhaps another Vatican official. Instead, Pope Leo XIV himself entered, alone. The entire choir rose to their feet immediately. Father Lorenzo stepped forward, bowing deeply. Your Holiness, we didn't expect— The Pope raised his hand gently. Please be seated, all of you. His voice was warm, with none of the tension that had been evident all week. He closed the door behind him and moved to the center of the room. The choir sat down hesitantly, many perched on the edges of their chairs. It was unprecedented for the Pope to visit them like this, especially in the middle of a Sunday Mass. You're wondering why I've asked you here? Pope Leo began, his eyes moving kindly over each face. First, I want to thank you for your beautiful music last week. Despite the unexpected events that followed, your performance with Signor Moretti was truly magnificent. A few choir members murmured their thanks, still confused. I know there has been much talk about what happened at the reception, the Pope continued. Many have expressed outrage on my behalf. Others have demanded public apologies or used the moment to further divide our already fractured world. He paused, clasping his hands in front of him. But today I wish to share something with you before I share it with the world. Father Lorenzo shifted nervously. Your Holiness, we are honored, but shouldn't you be— At Mass? The Pope smiled. Cardinal Bianchi is reading the Gospel now. We have a little time. He moved toward the piano in the corner of the room, a simple upright instrument used for rehearsals. Nothing like the grand piano that had been positioned in the basilica. A collective intake of breath swept through the room as Pope Leo XIII sat down at the piano bench. He adjusted his robe slightly, then placed his hands on the keys. Before I entered seminary at the age of 23, he said quietly, I studied for 5 years at the Milan Conservatory. Without further explanation, his fingers began to move across the keys. The opening notes of Bach's Prelude in C major, the same piece Alessandro Moretti had played at the beginning of last week's concert, filled the rehearsal room. But this was no amateur attempt. The Pope's hands moved with practiced precision, his interpretation both technically flawless and deeply reverent. Sophia felt her jaw drop. She glanced at Giovanni, whose eyes had widened in astonishment. Father Lorenzo stood frozen, his usual composure completely abandoned. As the Pope played, his eyes occasionally closed in concentration. His body swayed slightly with the music, revealing years of training and a profound connection to Bach's composition. There was something different about his interpretation compared to Moretti's. It was more contemplative, perhaps, with a touch more space between the notes, but it was every bit as masterful. When the final notes faded, no one spoke. The Pope looked up at their stunned faces and smiled gently. Music has always been my first language, he said. Even after I heard God's call to priesthood, I never stopped playing, though I did so in private. Father Lorenzo finally found his voice. Your Holiness, this is extraordinary. Why have you never shared this gift publicly? The Pope's expression turned reflective. When I chose to serve God, I wanted to do so with humility. I feared that if I became known for my music, it might become a distraction from my true calling. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys. But now I believe I was mistaken. Our gifts are not meant to be hidden, but to glorify God in all their fullness. Sophia raised her hand tentatively, then immediately regretted the childish gesture. But the Pope nodded to her with an encouraging smile. Your Holiness, is this why you've placed a piano in the basilica today? She asked. Yes, he confirmed. Today I will play Bach's most challenging fugue, the very piece Signor Moretti performed last week. He looked around the room, his expression earnest, not to prove anything or to embarrass anyone, but to demonstrate that dialogue between art and faith can take many forms. That we can disagree about interpretation while respecting each other's gifts. Giovanni leaned forward. But Your Holiness, Signor Moretti was so disrespectful. He humiliated you publicly. The Pope considered this. He spoke from passion, not malice. In my younger days at the conservatory, I too was known for my fierce defense of my interpretations. A hint of mischief appeared in his eyes, though perhaps with slightly more diplomacy. This broke the tension in the room, and several choir members laughed softly. The Pope stood up from the piano bench. Now I have a special request. After I play the fugue during Mass, I would like the choir to join me for the Magnificat. I will accompany you myself. Father Lorenzo looked as though he might faint. Your Holiness, we haven't rehearsed with you. The timing, the dynamics. We will find our way together, Pope Leo said confidently. Music, like faith, requires trust. He checked the small watch on his wrist. "We should return. Cardinal Bianchi can only extend his homily for so long before the congregation grows restless." As they filed back toward the basilica, Sophia felt a strange mix of emotions: awe at what she had witnessed, excitement about what was to come, and curiosity about how the world would react. She thought of Alessandro Moretti, wondering if he would hear about what was about to happen. The Pope paused at the door, turning back to address them one final time. "What you have seen today has been private for most of my life. Soon it will be known to all. I ask for your prayers as I take this step." Father Lorenzo bowed deeply. "We are honored by your trust, Holy Father." As they re-entered the basilica, the congregation stirred with curiosity. The Pope moved confidently toward the altar. Then, to the surprise of the thousands present, turned and approached the piano. A hush fell over St. Peter's as Pope Leo XV adjusted the microphone and addressed the faithful. "My dear brothers and sisters," he began, his voice echoing through the vast space, "today I wish to share something with you that I have kept private for many years." A collective gasp echoed through St. Peter's Basilica as Pope Leo XIV seated himself at the piano. The congregation, which had been buzzing with speculation moments before, fell into a stunned silence. Even the most seasoned Vatican observers looked at each other in confusion. Never in modern history had a pope performed music during Mass, let alone on a concert piano. "My dear brothers and sisters," Pope Leo began, his voice carrying clearly through the perfect acoustics of the basilica. "Before I entered seminary and devoted my life to serving God, I studied at the Milan Conservatory of Music for 5 years. Music was my first language for speaking to the divine, before words, before theology, before doctrine." He smiled gently at the sea of bewildered faces. Cameras flashed despite the usual restrictions, and journalists scribbled frantically in their notebooks. "Last week during our charity concert, I had the pleasure of hearing Maestro Alessandro Moretti perform Bach's music brilliantly. Afterward, we had a brief discussion about musical interpretation that became, shall we say, somewhat heated." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the congregation. "Rather than address this moment with words alone, I wish to continue our conversation through the language we both understand best, music itself." With that, Pope Leo XIV placed his hands on the keys. The first notes of Bach's Contrapunctus 9 from The Art of Fugue, one of the composer's most technically challenging works and the very piece over which he and Alessandro had clashed, filled the sacred space. Sophia stood with the choir at the side of the altar, watching in amazement as the Pope's fingers moved with practiced precision across the keyboard. His technique was flawless, his phrasing thoughtful and deliberate. She glanced at Father Lorenzo, whose mouth remained slightly open in astonishment. Throughout the basilica, people sat transfixed. Many pulled out phones to record the historic moment, and Vatican security, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented situation, made no move to stop them. Cardinal Bianchi stood nearby, a mixture of pride and lingering concern on his face. He alone had been informed of the Pope's plan just hours earlier, and even he had struggled to believe what he was hearing. As the complex fugue reached its climax, Sophia noticed movement near the back of the basilica. A dark-haired figure had slipped in through a side entrance and stood partially hidden by a column. Even from a distance, she recognized Alessandro Moretti. The pianist stood motionless, his expression unreadable as he watched the Pope perform. Pope Leo XIV concluded the piece with grace and subtlety, allowing the final notes to resonate through the vast space. When he finished, there was a moment of complete silence, that perfect pause that follows truly moving music, before the basilica erupted in applause. The Pope raised his hand for quiet, his expression humble. "Bach's music teaches us something essential about both faith and art," he said when the applause subsided. "In a fugue, different voices maintain their distinct identities while creating harmony together. They do not need to erase their uniqueness to find beauty in their combination." He smiled. "Perhaps there is a lesson there for all of us." He turned toward the choir. "And now, with your permission, I would like to accompany our wonderful Vatican choir in Bach's Magnificat, which they have prepared with great dedication." Father Lorenzo snapped to attention, quickly arranging the choir in their positions. Sophia took her place in the soprano section, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. They had never rehearsed with the Pope as accompanist. Would their practice timing match his interpretation? Her worries vanished the moment the music began. Pope Leo's accompaniment was sensitive and supportive, creating a foundation that made it easy for the choir to follow. As they sang the ancient text celebrating Mary's joy, Sophia felt a rare sense of everything falling perfectly into place. The choir responded to the Pope's playing instinctively, and he to their voices, creating a musical conversation of remarkable beauty. From her position, Sophia could see Alessandro still standing at the back of the church. He had moved from behind the column, now standing in full view, his arms crossed but his expression gradually softening as the performance continued. When the Magnificat concluded, the applause was even more thunderous than before. People rose to their feet, many wiping away tears. The Pope acknowledged the choir with a gesture of respect before turning back to the congregation. In my life, I have found that the greatest misunderstandings often come between people who care deeply about the same things, he said. Passion for truth, for beauty, for excellence. These can sometimes lead us to forget our shared humanity. His gaze moved toward the back of the basilica, and Sophia realized he had spotted Alessandro as well. I would like to extend a special thanks to Maestro Alessandro Moretti, whose performance last week reminded me of the joy music brought to my early life. I understand he is with us today. The Pope gestured toward the back of the church. Maestro, would you honor us by coming forward? A murmur swept through the congregation as people turned to look. For a moment, Sophia thought Alessandro might flee. He seemed frozen in place, clearly caught off guard. Then slowly he began walking down the center aisle. The crowd parted to let him through, and cameras followed his progress. When he reached the front, he stood awkwardly before the Pope, who had risen from the piano bench. Your Holiness, Alessandro said, his voice unusually subdued. I had no idea you were a pianist of such caliber. Pope Leo smiled. Few did. It was my private conversation with God for many years. Alessandro looked down. I must apologize for my behavior at the reception. My words were passionate, the Pope interjected, as they should be when discussing Bach, though perhaps we might both learn to express our passion with greater charity. His eyes twinkled. I am still working on that myself. This unexpected admission from the Pope drew a small laugh from Alessandro and relieved smiles from those nearby. I stand by my interpretation of Bach, Alessandro said, a hint of his usual confidence returning. As do I, replied the Pope with equal conviction. But perhaps next time we could discuss our differences over coffee, rather than in front of the international press. The tension that had built over the week dissolved in the genuine warmth of the moment. The Pope extended his hand and Alessandro shook it firmly. Cameras flashed rapidly, capturing the reconciliation. Cardinal Bianchi stepped forward, guiding the service back to its liturgical path. As the Mass continued, Sophia noticed Alessandro had been invited to sit in the front row. He remained for the entire service, his expression thoughtful. Afterward, as people flooded out of the basilica into the sunlit square, the mood was jubilant. The story had already spread beyond the walls of Vatican City. The Pope, who was secretly a concert pianist, the public reconciliation with the famous musician who had insulted him. It would be in every newspaper by evening, on every news broadcast worldwide. In the choir's robing room, Sophia hung up her robe as Father Lorenzo addressed them, still looking dazed by the morning's events. In 30 years leading this choir, he said, shaking his head in wonder, I never imagined I would be conducting with the Holy Father as our pianist. Giovanni nudged Sophia. Look at the door. She turned to see Pope Leo XIV entering once more, now accompanied by Alessandro Moretti. The entire choir fell silent. I've had an idea, the Pope announced. Maestro Moretti and I have been discussing the possibility of a joint concert for charity. 2 different interpretations of Bach, side by side, showing how different approaches can both honor the composer's genius. Alessandro nodded. His Holiness has convinced me that our disagreement could be transformed into something beneficial. We're thinking of a world tour, with proceeds supporting music education for disadvantaged children. Sophia could hardly believe what she was hearing. And the choir? She asked impulsively, then blushed at her boldness. The Pope smiled at her. Would